I am with Dr. Sander van der Linden, a professor of psychology at the University of Cambridge and all-around science baddie and author of the amazing Foolproof. If you haven't read this yet, you should totally read this. And I am so excited to get to know Sander better and ask him some questions because I have lots of questions. But how are you, Sander?
I'm good. Thanks so much for having me on and excited to talk to you.
I am so excited to get to ask you some questions. But let's just start with, can you tell me a bit more about your background?
Yeah, so I'm a psychologist, and I study why people believe the things they do. I got interested in this a long time ago, long before most people became interested in the topic of misinformation and conspiracy theories. In fact, when I first started writing about this, maybe 15 years ago, people thought conspiracy theories were kind of for the fringes of society, that nobody really believed in that stuff. But I was very intrigued in the sort of worldview, non-evidence-based worldviews that people find themselves in, and how that works, and how our beliefs operate in those contexts, how we're influenced by other people and the things they say. And over time, I became more and more interested in how people are impacted by bad information, and what we can do about it. And particularly, I started working on tools and interventions to try to empower people to sift through the onslaught of questionable information that we so frequently see online and elsewhere. That's what I've been doing for the last decade or so. I started out being intrigued by big science questions like climate change and vaccinations, and then of course there was COVID, but there's also election disinformation and so many international wars and so many things that popped up that there's never a boring day, really.
Mm. Yeah, and I actually met you through CIRCE, the Cognitive Immunology Research Collaborative,
Yeah.
because you're an
Yes.
inoculation theorist and I'm the education director. But can you explain then, you alluded to a solution, which I'm assuming might be inoculation. So if you could explain that.
Yeah, I meant inoculation. Yeah.
Could
You
you
want me to
explain
briefly
that?
explain
Yeah.
inoculation for people? Yeah. So one of the things that I started working on is this idea that just as with regular vaccines, where we expose people to a weakened or inactivated strain of a virus to try to trigger the production of antibodies to help confer resistance to future infection, it turns out you can do the same with the human mind. And a fellow psychologist back in the 60s was already onto this idea. And in fact, he got perhaps some inspiration from Aristotle. It goes all the way back. But the basic premise is really that rather than just giving people more facts, which is the default response of many science communicators, is just let's give people the facts. It's really more about exposing people to a weakened dose of misinformation or the tactics used to spread disinformation, and deconstructing and refuting those in advance so people can build up cognitive or mental antibodies when they're exposed to the full dose of misinformation in the future. And as you know, John Cook well, of course, when we were working on this quite a long time ago now, we started using the word pre-bunking to try to differentiate it from debunking, which is the traditional way of doing it. So inoculation or pre-bunking is really all about the power of prevention, particularly because when you come into this area and you study things like cults or conspiracy beliefs or people deep down the rabbit hole, it becomes really clear that it's extremely difficult to try to get people out. And so I started focusing more and more on this idea of prevention, and that's what inoculation is all about.
Yeah, I often joke that I focus my science communication efforts on what I call the normals. So like in a bell curve, right? There's
Yeah,
people in the
yeah.
middle and there's people on extremes. People over here really don't need me. And people over here, they're very hard to reach, especially with my time, energy, and skill set. But there are a large group of people in the middle that just don't know or have
Absolutely.
been slightly misinformed or are open. And if we get enough of them and move them, then we can establish some sort of herd immunity to various types of misinformation.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. People often ask, okay, well, how can I talk to my uncle who believes in conspiracy theories. But I think it's much more practical, as as you were just saying here, that there's this sort of big middle of people who are kind of exposed maybe, but not yet fully convinced or persuaded. And that's really the the target sort of category for I think for a lot of what we do, because people on the extremes are already so extreme and so rooted and in their worldviews that it's the amount of time and energy that it would take to with a low chance of success to sort of weigh that against all that we could gain by immunizing and sort of creating, as you said, larger herd immunity in the population. It's a trade-off. I do think it's important. Somebody's working on this. I mean, people do work on the extremes, and I think that can obviously be beneficial. It's just so much harder. So yeah, when you have limited in time and resources, I think the common advice is to focus on the people that you can reach.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not trying to say that those people aren't reachable, because I don't want to write anybody off. But I
Exactly.
just can't imagine that my time would be best spent doing something like that. And you're right, the bigger bang for the buck is the people in the middle. But so along these lines, because I do spend a lot of time on social media communicating
Mhm.
science. And one of the questions that comes up quite regularly is, but what is misinformation, and who gets to decide what misinformation is? So can you help me with that?
Yeah, it's a great question, very political question now. I think the number one question that I often get is, okay, but who decides what is misinformation? What makes you qualified to say whether something is misinformation or not? It's a sensitive topic, and I understand why people have these questions. But I think we have to try to differentiate, and this is helpful for people as well, is whether we're having a serious conversation about you know how can we actually classify things as misinformation versus the sort of organized attacks on the concept of truth and misinformation itself. People who really don't, the biggest purveyors of misinformation obviously have an interest in making sure that it's a concept that seems, not easy to define, that it's blurry, and that you can't, no hard boundaries. We can't identify people who spread it, or that, it's not a coherent concept. So I think we have to be a bit wary of some of the pushback, because you would obviously expect that some of the super spreaders are not going to be keen if there's some sort of consensus on what is misinformation, because that now means that they can be targeted. Similarly, maybe for social media companies, if there's a consensus on misinformation, that means that now they would have to do something about it. And so there is this sort of pushback against what is misinformation, disinformation, that I think is slightly disingenuous, in the sense that they're just political attempts to try to undermine any sort of science on it. And then there's legitimate scientific questions about how we actually do this. There's attacks from both the left and the right, intellectual kind of attacks, and so they're slightly different types of concerns. But I would say that an overriding theme is what I would characterize as some reincarnation of postmodernism, and it sort of comes down to the question of can we know truth? Can we know what is real, what is not? How scientists have values, scientists have biases. How can we trust that, people who have values and biases have some sort of uber, are above the fray and can somehow be a neutral actor that can identify misinformation? That's a very postmodern notion to me, that, the idea that nobody can really sort of rise above and be the ultimate arbiter of truth, because we're all involved in some sort of value-laden debate, and that as humans we all have competing biases and needs and desires, and that it's impossible to separate those out from the science, and that because of that, definitions of misinformation can be trusted. So that to me is an inherently postmodern notion, but it isn't the only thing that would make it postmodern. I think what makes it postmodern is the additional layer that is an accusation of sort of abuse of power. So the thing about postmodernism is that there's a sort of suspicion amongst this idea of scientism and elites who decide what is science and what is not. And similarly here, I think there's this concern that there's these scientists or misinformation experts who are an elite class that are using the concept of misinformation to oppress and suppress and censor narratives in society. So there's a sort of power structure of there's one end that's coming up with a definition, and there's the other people who are being subjected to this, and that this power structure creates an unfair sort of balance. And together, I think that is a classic sort of postmodern cocktail of where this sort of issue comes from. And we can get into why I think postmodernism leads to a very dangerous path of post-truth, where we can't define anything, and if you can't define anything, you can't do anything about it, and that leads to the sort of nihilism that I don't think is useful or practical. So just changing direction slightly now about what I think misinformation is and what we do about it. From a scientific point of view, I think it's clear. I mean, misinformation is defined as misinformation is defined as information that's either false or misleading. So these are two concepts: false and misleading. And even though people portray the sort of, nobody agrees on this, there's a consensus report from the American Psychological Association that I chaired, of people with very different views. We all agree misinformation has two components: information that's either false or misleading. Expert surveys that have been done of the literature among different disciplines, qualitative scholars, quantitative scholars, political science, sociology, psychology, broad agreement that the definition of misinformation is both info that's false and misleading. And then examples of that, there's also majority agreement of what that is. Pseudoscience, conspiracy theories, deepfakes, propaganda. There is some disagreement among scholars about very concrete, specific things, like, when is it disinformation? When is it misinformation? When is satire? When is that misinformation versus just good old humor? So there are some gray areas, and of course we should recognize that not everything is black and white, but on the core of it, there's really strong consensus. But then of course you get to what is false and what is misleading. So on the false question, how do you determine whether something is false or not? Again, you can sort of endorse this sort of postmodern view that even science doesn't know everything, and science is uncertain, and science evolves over time, and so we can't make any claims about what's true or false in this given moment. But I think we can all recognize that the Earth is round and not flat. Gravity is real. Global warming is happening, and so I think some of this uncertainty is true for novel science that's emerging, but it's not necessarily a barrier to how we sort of define this information. So how do you know what's false, right? We turn to scientific consensus. There's a consensus among scientists that humans are causing global warming, right? Over 99% of publishing scientists agree on this. There's scientific consensus that smoking leads to disease and cancer, even though people have tried to obscure this link for decades. Oh, correlation, causation. Oh, we can't know for sure. Maybe it's something else that's causing the cancer. There's now mounting evidence that, some of this was just propaganda. Even the tobacco companies knew all along that smoking was bad for you. The oil companies knew all along that the climate, that fossil fuels are causing climate change. They obscured the evidence. Their campaign was all about doubt, right? Sowing doubt about the science. So we can't define, and when we can't define, we can't act. And so that's, I think, part of the story. So scientific consensus, fact checkers who are dedicated to trying to understand what the facts are. They spend weeks doing, investigative journalism. And then, there's sometimes there isn't a fact check, and sometimes there isn't a scientific consensus, and we have to look at, somehow have to benchmark against what science knows in other ways. And of course, people say, okay, but who's fact checking the fact checkers? I mean, there are organizations. For example, fact checkers have to be part of the international fact checking network, right, to gain some sort of credibility, and there's oversight. people are fact checking the fact checkers. And how fact checkers are biased. I mean, individuals can always be biased, right? But overall, we're talking about the sort of the larger context here, that, fact checks do correlate with one another. Research, there's research on that actually shows that independent fact checkers all agree on what's false or misleading and not. And then you can say, okay, but they all agree because they all share the same political bias. But that's not necessarily true either, because if you look at some external benchmarks, that don't have to do with the political leaning, you actually see that there's still very high agreement amongst fact checkers in terms of the specific claims that they're checking. And so I think it's reasonable to say, sure, yeah, individual scientists, individual fact checkers can sometimes be biased, but the production, as a mechanism on the whole, there are safeguards in place that make sure that there is no systemic bias that influences the individual results. And I think that holds up pretty well. And then on misleading, people say, okay, but what's misleading? I mean, there's 2,000 years of philosophy on what's misleading, right? Aristotle, Socrates, right? They have a long history of documenting logical fallacies. What was a logical fallacy 2,000 years ago? Scapegoating groups, using false dichotomies, making incoherent arguments, using ad hominem attacks, things that are often used in misinformation to produce it, these sort of tactics, they're still fallacious today, right? History didn't change, philosophy didn't change. 2,000 years later, we still recognize, right, that all of these things are still dubious. The sort of magical elixirs that, we're going to cure you in the 15th century, they're still not going to cure cancer today, right? We know that, apricot kernels can actually cause dangerous poisoning instead of curing cancer. And so I think a lot of this debate isn't so much about, can we do it? I mean, clearly both history and science shows we can do it. There is agreement, but there's a political dimension to it that people often don't want us to do it. I think there are fair meta questions like, who, should misinformation experts determine what is true or not? My view is not necessarily. I mean, I don't go around proclaiming myself to be an expert on the lab leak theory or climate change or vaccines. I turn to scientific consensus and fact checkers and people who are domain experts who've studied this for decades and have actual knowledge about these things. And that's how we verify what's correct or not. And misinformation experts do study techniques of propaganda, regardless of the content, right? We're talking about what black propaganda, gray propaganda. What are some of the techniques that are used across different issues? For example, leaving out context or impersonating doctors or creating conspiracies or scapegoating minority groups or using false equivalents in argumentation. These are general tactics that don't have to do with any specific issues that misinformation experts do study and have some authority on. But I agree that when it comes to very specific claims, we can turn to domain experts and fact checkers, and claims that those are all biased, I think really don't hold up to scrutiny on the average. And we have to ask ourselves whether people are politically motivated to try to obscure these definitions. That was a very long answer, Melanie, but hopefully that was useful.
No, yeah, and my mind is just swimming because there was so much good stuff in there. Let me try to wrap my head around this a bit, because I from my perspective, what I see is on the right, there seems to be an attack on misinformation experts, in that oftentimes the misinformation is used to confirm a bias. And if you don't want to accept, if you don't want to be wrong, then of course, calling that misinformation is a form of censorship in your head. And so just deny the claims of misinformation. I didn't say that very well. My point, like, I actually understand the motivation. It seems a very simple, like, I want this to be true. They're calling it misinformation, so they must not know what they're talking about. They must have a political bias or something. So So there's that, and often I could see that coming actually as disinformation, where the industries are purposefully putting out that message to give people who want to align their beliefs with that tribe. Um, that's an out, right? It's a way to discount what you don't want to hear. I often wonder actually if that's a form of inoculation itself, to inoculate people against the truth. Um, if I could just like keep going here for a second, because the rest here on the left, I still don't understand where that's coming from. Um, in that, if it seems to me that if I'm guessing, most of the people on the left actually understand what a scientific consensus is and do seem to understand that we can know what truth is. So, like, they might say that, yeah, we know climate change is real, or that we know vaccines can work. But yet, and we know that because of scientific consensuses. Yes, individuals can have biases, but that's the reason that we have a community checking biases and so on, so that we can get closer to a truth together. But for some reason, when it comes to the subject of misinformation itself, like this sort of meta version, then that's what crosses the line that we can't trust the consensus. Like you mentioned, the APA having a consensus statement on what misinformation is and using inoculation to counter
Mhm.
misinformation. But yet, that is a bridge too far. I don't know if any of what I just said made sense or how you want to respond to any of that.
Yeah, I think it makes sense. I mean, it's clear, for example, if you're on the right, let's say, take election denial, right, that the conspiracy that the election was stolen. I mean, that serves some sort of group signaling function, right? That we're all part of this movement that rejects Biden, and some people may generally believe in the conspiracy that was a conspiracy against Trump, and that they want that to be true. And so if you say that, Biden legitimately won, then that's misinformation and so on. And so they just kind of revert the concept for anything that is not congenial to their ideology, so that it can be dismissed as misinformation. I think, sure, on the left, people are generally more congenial to what the consensus is on science. But I think you have to understand that, certainly this is my experience, that there are people on the left who don't like the concept of scientific consensus. I mean, there are scientists who feel that they're contrarians, right? And they feel that I think sometimes they don't sort of recognize their own Galileo fallacy, that they feel like they're heroes because they're going against the consensus and they want to be the contrarian scientist, but they don't realize that actually most of the time people who are most of the contrarians actually aren't right just by the mere fact of being a contrarian, right? And so I think there's some of that Galileo syndrome fallacy going on, of like, okay, but what about Galileo? And so yeah, he was persecuted and so on, but so there's a small
Yeah.
group of scientists who
We
have
don't remember. Well, yeah, I just wrote about this. We don't remember Galileo because he was a contrarian. We remember him because he was right. Right? He had
right.
evidence, and that's how we remember him. So this idea that I'm Galileo, I mean, you got to have more than just disagreeing. I'm
You
sorry.
got to have more than disagreeing, but yeah, there's certainly kind of a small group of scientists who feel they want to go in a different movement, and hence want to go against the consensus. A lot of philosophers actually like conspiracy theories. I mean, I've given talks about conspiracies to a group of philosophers, and they're sort of like, okay, but what is truth? And but some conspiracies are real, and isn't it a tool to hold government accountable? And actually, they find that psychologists, pathologize the whole operation a bit too much. They sort of feel like, well, you're medicalizing this and suggesting people are irrational, but maybe our prior should be that we should be suspicious that people behind the scenes are pulling the strings. But actually, statistically, that's not rational. And if you look at the evidence, we know that people have modeled this. That NASA faked the moon landing. I mean, David Grimes, who's a physicist, actually modeled this. 400,000 people at NASA all colluding together. If you do the model, imminent failure of like how many people could keep this a secret over time.
I think
Um,
he's what it said, like about 4 years that would have lasted.
that one was about 4 years. Yeah. The ones where you have other public health bodies and other public agencies, then it's much faster because they would all have to be in it together. Um, right? And so yeah, it's just not reasonable. But yeah, people on the left, particularly I find in maybe humanities or in that direction, tend to have I don't want to call it postmodern, but they do have some this idea of alternative I would say alternative facts, but subjective truth, right? Alternative knowledge, subjective truth, holding power accountable. They have suspicions about consensus, about official explanations, and so that I think that drives some of the skepticism on the left, and some of them worry that. And I don't know how genuine of a concern this is, but I often hear that in order to gain trust, um, we shouldn't really be censoring anything. And so they're sort of saying, well, if we want to gain more trust from the other side of the political spectrum, then we should be against censorship. And misinformation. I think here's the sort of conflation for me in this, that I generally agree that I'm not pro censorship anything, except for maybe hate speech and other serious offenses. But the idea is that once you define misinformation, and that means you can now act on it. And I think the worry is that once we're all in agreement kind of what misinformation is, that it means it's going to be actionable, which means that some groups in society are going to be disproportionately targeted, maybe if they spread a lot of it, which is going to lead to sort of this decline in trust and accusations of censorship. And you are seeing this play out in reality. So a lot of the lawsuits from Jim Jordan, for example, on the Biden administration, he's attacking the NSF, right? He's going after all of the main science actors, are because in their view, based on how misinformation is defined, the conclusion from research is often that extreme conservative outlets are spreading more of it, and conservative elites are spreading more of it, and so they feel targeted and censored, and that's what's causing this sort of backlash. And I think some people on the left have this sort of idea that rather than sticking to what the science says and sort of doubling down on empirical science, they have this inclination that, okay, maybe we need to step back and not define misinformation and avoid this whole thing, so that we don't have accusations of censorship. But to me, there's a bit of a fallacy in there, because a lot of the people who work on misinformation don't want to censor anything. I mean, most people that I work with, we want to empower people to be better information discerners, not tell people what to believe. We don't want to take down content. We don't want to censor stuff. And so I think that's a misconception. I think defining misinformation only enables free speech preserving solutions, rather than coming to this sort of conclusion of that it must be censored. I mean, the examples people come up with are like far. They're really few and far between. I mean, this sure, Facebook, Meta took down man-made theories about COVID for 2 months throughout the whole year, because all the public health experts were saying that it wasn't man-made. And so they listened to the science. For 2 months, they took down posts. I mean, who knows what they took down? I mean, my guess is 90% of what they took down were crazy bioweapon conspiracies. If you have a look at what's going on Facebook. But let's say they accidentally censored some legitimate debate, right, for 2 months. Then they again listened to the experts who said, "Whoa, there's more debate now." So they stopped the policy. I mean, it's a Bayesian model, right? New evidence, you update, you change. And so I don't think this was some nefarious attempt to sort of censor debates on the lab leak. I mean, it's a prominent example, because a lot of people on the right feel that misinformation was used as a weapon to sort of censor the debate. But as you've seen, the first consensus survey recently came out, putting median likelihood amongst all this epidemiological disease virologists, biosafety experts, at 90% likelihood it was a natural zoonosis. They're not saying that the lab leak is impossible. They're just saying that the odds, based on the science, are not leaning towards a lab leak, and that I think is caused a lot of confusion, particularly when these things become political, right? When the government puts out intelligence documents that says we're uncertain or it can't be ruled out, and even when one or two agencies actually say we think it was a leak, that creates a lot of public confusion and a lot of conflict, because now the government is saying something else than what the scientific community is saying. And I think that causes a lot of confusion for people. And so this sort of triangle between government, social media companies, and the public, and how we sort of negotiate what is misinformation and is not is really tricky, right? Because there's worries about censorship, there's worries about the scientific community being free to express what their findings are, government intelligence expressing what their investigations, scientists collaborating with government, scientists collaborating with social media companies. So it is a tricky triangle. But I think there are a lot of bad faith attempts here to try to undermine the pursuit of what is misinformation and what is accurate information, and how can we help people, discern between the two.
So maybe what I just heard in there is from the left, there's concern about the implications of calling something misinformation. So then avoid calling a spade a spade. So don't call it misinformation because there are potential implications of what do we do about it. So just it is a form of solution aversion then.
It is. I do think, yeah, it's a good way of putting it. I mean, there was just an article in the New Yorker that wasn't, you know, it was a it was a reasonable analysis, but the whole point was that we shouldn't be talking about disinformation anymore because it's being weaponized by the right, and it just gives them power. We should just forget about this whole concept, more or less, and don't do anything about it. And that's, I think that it's very much, as you said, some sort of fear of backlash, it's solution aversion. And sometimes it's interesting because you also see the psychological differences between the left and the right play out, right? People on the left aren't as organized. They're not as interested in perhaps in conflict. They're more avoidant of certain questions, and so they don't think about it in the same way. And so that's, people on the right are very organized, right? The tribalism is a big sort of psychological theme if you look at the psychology of left-right differences. And so, these functions serve different purposes. Not saying one is bad, one is good, but yeah, there's a different psychology at play, and I think the left could do more with. I'm certainly, in the camp of look, we disinformation is a big threat. We have clear evidence on what it is, what it isn't. We have workable solutions that should be acceptable to people on both sides of the spectrum, and that's what we should be defending, and not hide under the sheets and just hope that it goes away.
So can I go back and ask this question because about is telling people in advance that they're going to call this disinformation and that's just them wanting to censor you. Is that a form of inoculation?
Yeah, so let's get a bit specific about it. So there's pre-bunking and inoculation, and I think in what I like to do is be very strict about what inoculation is. Like, it has to follow the vaccine analogy exactly. So you would have to give people a weakened dose of what the opponent is going to say, that like a straw man version almost, if you wanted to do it in a bad faith way, right? And then you take it down, and you bolster people's existing attitudes. So for example, to make that practical, let's say that I'm Trump. I'm going to say, look, there's people that are going to tell you the election wasn't stolen, that it was all safe, but they're all part of the deep state. They're all satanic pedophiles, right? And so what you need to know is that it was stolen, and here's the evidence I have, and it was stolen. And I know that because you've said it before, and so I'm kind of bolstering your existing attitude towards it being stolen. Then I'm giving a weakened presentation of what the opposition will say, and then I'm going to refute that. And so that would be a counter inoculation in a way, right? So that could be inoculation. Pre-bunking, though, is just about sort of getting there first without having to adhere to the strict inoculation format. So You know, if you don't use the weakened dose, if you don't use the sort of forewarning element that comes with inoculation, that you know somebody is going to manipulate you, however, you should know this and this, then it's just a pre-bunk, and you can do you know pre-bunking in any way. The only criteria really is that you say something before the other party does. So you try to pre-bunk whatever they're going to say, and you can do that in a variety of ways. It doesn't have to be through the way of inoculation, but you can do it via the sort of weakened dose and then refuting that weakened dose, and that makes it inoculation. But if you do it another way, it's still pre-bunk, but not exactly inoculation. So often what I see Trump doing is actually not specifically inoculation, but he's more trying to sort of preemptively discredit legitimate sources and outlets. So he will say, oh, the mainstream media is fake news, don't listen to them. They're going to tell you that, you know, the election was, you know, the election result was accurate, but I have evidence, you know, saying that it's false. And so is that, you know, is that inoculation or just a pre-bunk? I don't think he actually, you know, uses a weakened dose of the facts for that matter. I think he just tries to discredit a lot of the time, you know, discrediting official sources. And he does try to pre-bunk sometimes by you know going to the audience and saying, look, they're about to tell you this, but you should listen to me because so and so. But I would describe that technically as a pre-bunk and not the whole sort of inoculation procedure, because you actually do have to present a weakened version of your opponent's argument and then make a very persuasive case for why that weakened version is actually false. And I suspect, you know, they don't know about this method probably, and so they're just trying to wing it, and the end result is more of a general kind of pre-bunk. And so maybe it would actually be dangerous if they saw this video and got some ideas from it.
Well, yeah, so that's interesting because I would have called pre-bunking a form of inoculation and not necessarily
Mhm.
worked out those terms that way. So when you were saying that, I'm thinking about when so fact about me, I grew up in a young earth creationist church. So
Okay, yeah.
you know, Western Iowa, the earth was 6,000 years old and everything was made as it currently is. And they would have really elaborate, like in Sunday school and in sermons, we would get, well, they're going to tell you this, but this is why that's wrong. And they would arm you with ways to protect yourself against those arguments in the real world. Um, is that pre-bunking? Inoculation?
Uh, No, I would so I would say that's inoculation. So you know, cults do use inoculation, and we know that. And so because they have mastered that technique, unfortunately. So the reason why I use pre-bunking as the meta sort of or the biggest category is because you know other people are pre-bunking just by doing something first in time. So for example, an accuracy nudge, which is just you know you nudge people to be accurate in their judgments before they share some misinformation on social media. So you might get uh, uh, a nudge online that says, "Hey, think about you know the concept of accuracy. Now, do you want to share some headlines?" And people share less misinformation because they've been nudged to think about accuracy. Because that technically comes before exposure to the misinformation. That's people call it a pre-bunk because technically it comes before, but it has nothing to do with inoculation. So I think there's lots of ways you could pre-bunk simply by you know using the time dimension and not having any restrictions on the actual format. So I think what you know inoculation is very strict on the format. So I would say that pre-bunking is part of inoculation, but you know, inoculation isn't always part of pre-bunking. Maybe that's a good way to think about it. That yeah, the pre-bunk is part of the inoculation process, but in you know, pre-bunking itself doesn't always require the inoculation format. In your case, I would say it's inoculation because my experience with those, you know, I had a good friend growing up who was a Jehovah's Witness, and we would get pamphlets. They have this magazine. I was like amazed by it. They have this magazine that comes and basically lists all the arguments people would come up with, you know, science-based arguments. But what they would do, these were bad faith representations of the science. And so I would like, that's not what the science says. They'll say, oh, they'll tell you that this and this, the Bible's not literal and so on. And And then they would have the refutations that you can memorize. And then you would go out and then you argue with people. And that's, that's a form of inoculation because you're giving a weakened dose of the actual science. Then you're providing very persuasive counter arguments that resonate with what people want to believe. And then you rehearse that with people so that they become inoculated. And that's, unfortunately, cults and extreme religious communities can use that technique. And that's, it's powerful, but it's unfortunate. So that's I would say is closer to the actual inoculation, and maybe that leads to an interesting segue actually, because the critics of the you can't define misinformation sort of thing will often say, okay, is religion misinformation then? And they do that because they know a lot of people are religious. So whatever I'm going to say next is not going to be perceived well. But my honest answer to that question is, and I grew up in well, secular most of my life, obviously, but considering myself somewhat of a part-time skeptic, but or professional skeptic, and also in my personal life. But when I was younger, I was part of some more orthodox circles where there was heavy propaganda involved, and I became very intrigued in how they're doing this and how. So it's not that I'm some individual who's sort of talking about religion in a meta way. I've never experienced it. I mean, certainly I was also bombarded by propaganda when I was younger, and I have a lot of experience talking to extremist religious individuals, and what struck me is that, yes, there's a lot of false information in religion. I would say that if you define it as not conforming to scientific consensus, fact checks, misleading rhetoric, I would say that, yes, I mean, a lot of religion is just not accurate at best, misleading at worst. Technically, yes, it's misinformation. It's that simple. Now, the more difficult question, I think, is it disinformation? I'm a bit more hesitant about that. I think there are some religions, like the examples we just discussed, maybe Scientology and some other examples where there's there's some malicious intent to control people. These are called high sort of control groups where they use propaganda to try to get compliance and intimidate people, and they have a propaganda playbook, and those are clear examples of disinformation. Other religions are more organized, from the bottom up, like socially, and it's not clear that there is much control going on, or organized kind of propaganda. So I would say maybe that's more misinformation than disinformation. So yeah, for me, the disinformation is more about the intent. Like, is there some malicious, premeditated intent here, and some playbook of disinfo tactics? Or is this more of a social phenomenon? People aren't really organized. They just believe things that are, not congenial to what the science says. And then, in things in the middle, like spirituality, obviously people are free to believe whatever they want to believe. But the question is it evidence-based? And if not, then it's either false or misleading. Not sure what you think about this. I mean, you do this a lot in your free time. You talk to people who believe in ghosts, paranormal, pseudoscience. People don't always respond well when you tell them that that's misinformation.
Well, I want to go there, but first, to talk about disinformation for a second. For those at home, if you're not aware, misinformation is misleading. Disinformation is intentionally deceitful. Are you on the in your definition of disinformation? So, like, the oil companies were fully aware that they were pushing a misleading narrative at
Yeah.
best. So that was disinformation. But are people that pass that on in good faith who've actually been victims of it, is that still disinformation or is that misinformation?
Yeah, that's a great question. So for me, it is all about intent, and I would characterize the initial bit as disinformation, but then people passing it on because they honestly thought it was true. I think that's misinformation, right? People pass it on and they don't know that it's false. So I think at the second order level, it sort of becomes misinformation in a way when it spreads throughout society, even though the initial dissemination was disinformation. Although, you know, I can see the argument that if something was created as disinformation, then, you know, other people are just unintentionally spreading the disinformation, and you can sort of keep that definition because of its creation. So, you know, World War II propaganda was disinformation, right? Even though some people were unintentionally spreading it. So I don't know. I mean, I feel like from the vantage point of the people who are duped, it's misinformation. But if you want to talk about how it was created, then I would say it's disinformation.
Yeah. Yeah. That's generally what I've been saying. So it's good to hear you say that as well. Back to the ghosts and spiritual things and so on.
Sorry, let me
Yeah. Yeah.
I plug in my laptop. I see that there's a it's running low. Okay, go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. So back to the ghosts thing. So because I teach my background, I teach a science class. I've been teaching gen ed science for a very long time, and most of the time that's biology. That's what I was teaching, and I realized that I honestly, like, if I had one semester to teach students what they needed to know about science, that wasn't it. So I created a course in its place, and the whole course is based on what I call skills, not facts. So critical thinking, information literacy, and science literacy, and it's in that order, and walk students through like a process of understanding their beliefs, how they come to their beliefs, the limits of their perception and memory, understanding the importance of skepticism, what that looks like, the biases and heuristics and fallacies that might lead us astray, and then going to information and then going into science. And what I found in the process is that um, it's very difficult for me now to think about teaching something like science or teaching how to find good information if I don't first teach students why they might fall for something that isn't.
Hmm.
In that, like, if I want to teach students what science is, what science looks like, they need to be able to compare it to something that isn't science. So I bring in misinformation, pseudoscience, science denial, conspiracy theories, and so on. So they can see the difference and they understand their own vulnerabilities, their biases, emotions, identities, and so on that might lead them to fall for those things. But I've also found like I'm super grateful for people like you that focus on like the biggies, climate change and vaccines and even things like GMOs and election denial and so on. But if I went into class now and I started with something like that, I feel like I would just immediately trigger the students
Hmm.
who that is important to them. So I don't start there. So when I don't know if this is a form of inoculation, but what I do is I start with misinformation that is not triggering to them. Like the very first thing I
Sure.
do is a personality reading. And then the first lecture is about witches, the witch trials in Europe from like the 14th through 18th
Right,
centuries,
yeah.
because they don't believe that stuff, but they get to see what people who did believe that stuff do, like the kinds of things they thought people did, the kinds of evidence that they thought was absolutely convincing, and that they acted on those beliefs. So I want them to internalize that. But in the
Right.
process, like we talk about ghosts and UFOs and psychics and mediums and homeopathy and all those things. But I work through I kind of think of it like a spectrum where in the middle is the stuff that's not really triggering to anybody. And I kind of move like this throughout the semester. But I call it critical thinking training wheels. I teach them these skills with the training wheels on so that when they get to the more complex information, they know what that feels like. They have the skills under their belt. But something like ghosts and so on, what I teach students is, um, they're ghosts are a supernatural claim. But oftentimes, if people are making a claim about ghosts, they're claiming that the ghosts are having some sort of natural presence or impact on the physical world.
Right.
So let's evaluate that evidence. If this is our physical evidence, what are the potential causes? And then, we brainstorm. It could be this, but it also could be, what, the cat could have done that, or it could have been, any number of
Right.
things. So let's evaluate those and whittle away, Occam's razor, whittle away explanations until you finally get to, well, I mean, I suppose it could be ghosts, but We don't actually have very good evidence that ghosts exist at all. Could they? Sure. But our best evidence isn't very good. And so it's not very likely. So I don't know. Is any of that a form of inoculation? What do you think about addressing things that way?
Yeah. Well, I think it's certainly a good thing to do. It's very important, I think, to start with non-threatening examples so that people are more open to considering. It is kind of like a weekend dose before you move on to the fuller dose, sort of thing. So I do like that structure a lot. I think what
Even
you
though
said
it's not
about.
the same form of misinformation, is that true?
Yes, even though it's not the same form, this requires more what we call transference, right? So people, the sort of broader spectrum immunity that somehow, people have to make the link between the two, so that you often have to do some work to show people that there's this general framework, and that some of the same tricks are used across, let's say, pseudoscience, in order to. So, for example, what I often do, which is kind of similar, is that the stuff with the natural cures. Whether it's apricot kernels or some oil or some herb, it's often all connected to the naturalistic fallacy that if it's natural, right, it must be better. And so I think once people can see the underlying structure, you can sort of move up to examples that are a bit closer, perhaps a bit closer to home. Right? Don't start with vaccines, but eventually it's the same logic, right? That vaccines are not natural. So I do like that format quite a bit. I think the thing about the scientific theory is crucial, though. I think that's very important. I mean, when I teach my students about conspiracy theories in psychology classes, it's I think the thing is what you said. It's not very likely, and I think there's so much conflation about this in public debate about COVID and other issues. Nobody's saying that things are impossible. I wouldn't be a good scientist if we said that things were impossible. We just assign low likelihoods to things that have no evidence, or very little evidence, and that's pure. That's rational, and that's not censoring anything. It's not worth spending a lot of time. Certainly, somebody should investigate, right? It's a free society, right? And somebody has to look at it, but we shouldn't spend most of our time talking about things that have very little evidence. And sure, if people want to research it, that's great. And if more evidence emerges, then we can spend more time on it. But the thing with conspiracy theories that gets me, though, even from scholars who think, oh, but some have been true, it's that it's inherently unscientific, right? A conspiracy theory starts out already knowing the premise. There's somebody in secret plotting something with an agenda, and I just need to uncover the evidence for it. But that's not a scientific theory. That's not how we start. There should always be a non-conspiratorial alternative hypothesis, which is never present in a conspiracy theory. And so I think for that reason, people just kind of completely misunderstand why conspiracy theories are fallacious. I mean, the idea that people conspire is not bizarre, or strange necessarily. It's that specific conspiracy theories, we should assign a low likelihood of being true because they're not scientific theories and they're not tested in scientific ways. And so I think that distinction is often poorly understood by people in other disciplines too, right? Because they all know some conspiracy that turned out to be true, but they don't really follow the logic of how likely it is that these things are true. Particularly, I love the sort of conjunction fallacy bit where people, this is where it gets interesting from a psychological point of view, right? Is that people who believe in one conspiracy often believe in others because they think that actually it's much more likely that all of it is related and all of it is a conspiracy, while statistically the probability of multiple independent events being all true at the same time is by definition much lower than any single conspiracy being true, right? If you have totally different conspiracies that are not connected with each other, like Obama, about let's say Princess Diana was is still alive somewhere,
Yeah.
or she was already dead when they found her, right? Those are different theories that are independent, but somehow they're more likely, conspiracy theorists tend to think that they're both likely to be true at the same time. But we all know that the conjunction, right, of it is a subset and can, as such, it can never be more probable than independent events. The probability that she's both dead and alive must be smaller than the probability that she's either dead or alive.
I'm
So
going
it
to go out
doesn't
on a
look,
limb and
it
say
does,
that the probability that she's both dead and alive is 0.
right. And so unless you have a conspiracy that can explain maybe she's a lizard. And so that,
You're
that's where
right.
we
I
get,
missed
think
that
people,
one.
yeah. I think people just fail in their it's just a failure of logic, I think, to critically evaluate conspiracy theories most of the time. I'm always careful to say that clearly, people conspire to conduct fraud and financial schemes, and sure, that's part of life, but that's not discovered by grand armchair conspiracy theories about satanic pedophiles and stuff you read on the internet.
Yes.
It's the police, doctors, investigative journalists chasing the facts and uncovering that some bad people are doing bad things. And that's the end of that story. And that's usually how I explain it.
Yeah, mine is very similar. It's, conspiracy theories, obviously, we do know of some that are true, and I can tell you what those are. And the reason that we know that those are true is because we have evidence. So if you want to
Right.
uncover a conspiracy theory, it's not going to be conspiratorial thinking that does that. It's going to be critical thinking
Exactly.
and evidence. But I actually find the idea of just probabilistic thinking being something that most people don't often do. Like, things are true or false. They're right or wrong. They're yes or no, as opposed to being on a spectrum of probability. And denialists do this all the time, where, like, if the probability that we're not, if it's not 100%, then see, we could be wrong. Or if it's very close to 0, see, it could be true for a pseudoscience proponent. So just this idea of getting students to think about probability, or how confident we are that something is true on a spectrum. And I start that with just basic epistemology, like with idea of witches or ghosts or so on. And so by the time I get to something like a theory, which, oh my God, as a scientist, this is one of those words that just absolutely triggers me, because people do not understand what a scientific theory is. And so even when you tell them, like, it's an explanation that is broadly accepted, is supported by a vast amount of evidence, is useful to make predictions for further testing, has yet to be proven wrong, will never be proven 100% true. And that's what they'll hear, is that it hasn't been proven true. But in my experience, this is anecdotal, of course, teaching students about just the thinking about knowledge and likelihood on a spectrum, by the time I get to the process of science and bits of evidence starting to add up to more likely, till you finally get to something that is highly likely to be true, then they're more accepting of something like that. And just to put a bookend on the lab leak thing, like, I know nothing about this particular conspiracy theory, or even if it is a conspiracy theory, but I'm an ecologist by training, and I can tell you that um, the things that humans are doing to the planet leads to the chance of zoonotic spillover more and more likely. So if this isn't the case, if we don't learn our lesson from this one and ways to reduce the likelihood of new viruses going into humans, then it's bound to happen again. So I would just like us to learn our lesson that it is very likely.
I mean, that's what I hear from all the top virologists. They say, climate change stuff is going to increase the chances of zoonotic spillover. Thinking about future pandemics. Sure, maybe some people should care about biolab safety, but the overwhelming scenario here is spillovers. And again, I think maybe there was some science communication at the beginning of the pandemic that I think my take is what happened is that maybe some credible hypotheses that still have very little evidence, but are worthy of some sort of investigation, were lumped in with crazy conspiracy theories about bioweapons. And I think that created some unnecessary conflict where some people who had maybe, let's say, legitimate concerns about biosafety were lumped in with it's a military bioweapon conspiracy or some genetically mutated virus. And it's just I think that perhaps there could have been a bit more nuance in the science communication there, trying to separate those things out. That like, okay, well, what's a credible lab leak, hypothesis? What's a non-scientific type of hypothesis? And I think that may have been useful. But yeah, generally, I mean, everyone that I speak to, of course, scientists never say never, but yeah, a lot of them say, well, if it was engineered, this was a very badly engineered virus because it got everyone. And it just makes no sense, like logically or scientifically, for a lot of these explanations. But yeah, the concern is censorship, right? Right now, the concern is censorship, and as scientists, and I'm sure you feel the same way. I mean, that's very confident, but I have the impression that it's better to talk about things. It's better to arm people with the tools to critically think rather than censor. And so it is unfortunate that this is sort of a weird straw man position that this misinformation community has to deal with. That it's an effective strategy, right? Just say to people that, look, the people trying to do something about this want to censor, even though that's a total lie. And so it's an effective strategy, unfortunately. But I think we're trying to do our best to try to dismantle this falsehood and say, look, that's the last thing that we should be doing unless in extreme circumstances. What we want to do is empower people through critical thinking. And I think what you said about probabilistic thinking is exactly right, and sort of ties into this discussion about definitions too. Like I can see, with some of the science when it was emerging, when you say true false, it can be tricky if you think in binaries, right? Or ibuprofen is gonna, worsen the COVID, is gonna worsen COVID, right? One study came out. Turns out later another study said that wasn't necessarily true. So maybe it's actually safer to not think in true false. That's what I tend to do, and assign, likelihoods of misleadingness, so that we don't necessarily get into trouble later when we're talking about uncertainty in science. That we say, look, quality of evidence, there's, is this the famous headline, right? CDC doctor, healthy doctor died because of COVID vaccine. CDC is investigating why. Technically, that was not untrue, but the vaccine had nothing to do with the death of the doctor, right? So correlation causation fallacy. So it's not so easy to say this headline's false, but you can say it's misleading because it confuses correlation with causation. And so I think for a lot of things, what we can do is assign it a credibility rating or a misleadingness rating, and use that as our indicator of misinformation rather than, sort of have this sort of black and white view of, this is 100% misinformation, this is 100% true, because that you can do that for for some well-established sort of scientific findings, but for other things it's trickier. And so that's kind of what I'm thinking in terms of how to define things. But it's the label, right? So if something has a 70% likelihood of being misleading, and you say it's misinformation, for 30% of people, this will be problematic because or a small group of people think, well, there's a 30% chance that I'm right here, so now you're calling me misinformation. And I think that's the crux here, that we define it as either false or misleading. And of course, misleading means that something can't be entirely false. And if it's not entirely false, there must be some non-zero chance somebody could be right. And so labeling them as misinformation is censorship, or amounts to censorship. And so that's that's the tricky part that we have to navigate.
Yeah, and just putting this out there, that is not what censorship is. Like, and we're talking about freedom of speech according to, like the Constitution, at least in the United States. I hear this a lot, that, we have freedom of speech. And I mean, if the government isn't putting you in jail, then we're not talking about a Second Amendment issue, or sorry, First Amendment issue. And so there's a lot of confusion over censorship. I will personally say, like, I'm almost afraid to start the sentence because I get so riled up about it. Facebook has censored me so many times, put me in jail so many times for addressing misinformation, that I don't even bother to address that misinformation anymore. I just don't do it, because then I get put in jail and I can't communicate at all.
Yeah.
So
So,
I
but the
do end up
algorithm,
with
there's a
like
lot
cat
of false
jokes and
positives.
yes.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, so that's why I use, like, I even made a funny little video about it. That's why I use like cat and fart jokes, because, well, one, they're funny and they don't trigger people, but also it won't trigger the algorithm. Sorry.
Yeah, so yeah, exactly. So the algorithm makes mistakes, and there are lots of complaints when that happens. You know, I remember when they were cracking down on Holocaust denial, but then accidentally they take down also. You know, that's a worthy cause, but then they also took down historical educational videos from a lot of universities, right? And so there's a cost to censorship that is it's costly, and so we should only reserve that for the extremes, I think.
Okay, so Sandra, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate what you do. You're not only an amazing researcher, but you actually do an incredible job of communicating to the public, and that is a rare combination. So thank you for all of your SciComm efforts and research efforts.
Well, thanks so
And
much. That's very kind of you.
I wanted to just plug again for your book here. It is absolutely wonderful, but I have to say, as a science educator, there was a part of the book that I think impacted me more than others. And it was your acknowledgement section.
Okay, yeah.
So your very last paragraph or sentence of your acknowledgments to all my friends and colleagues over the years, but most of all to my high school teachers who were sure I would never amount to anything. This one is for you.
Yeah. That's true. I felt compelled to put that in there because I tried to do some self-reflection, and I wasn't the easiest student in high school. I didn't really follow the curriculum well. I was always drifting, being intrigued by other things than what the lesson plan had to offer. But I got into trouble a lot, and so much so that my parents had to come in and they said, look, you know, he's we don't know what this guy's up to, but it's we think he isn't going to amount to anything with this sort of attitude and with with his style of learning. And my parents, maybe they had too much faith in me, but they said, "Look, we're happy to sign whatever document you want. We trust him. We think he's going to graduate high school, following his own lesson plan." And they said, "Are you really going to gamble?" That he said, I'm the principal said, "Look, I'll tell the teachers to not say anything. He can follow his own crazy lesson plan, do everything his crazy way." But the cost is going to be on you. And my parents said, we'll take that gamble. And you know what? I graduated just fine. I did fine. I just had a different way of learning, a different way of engaging. I like to focus on things that weren't part of the exam. I realized I have to pass the exam, right? So I do the work to pass the exam, but I wanted to spend my time reading about other stuff. I wanted to go to college. I was thinking about other things. It was very rigid. I mean, it is not like liberal arts education in the U.S. It's very rigid. You have to follow a certain structure. There was little room for exploration. So I did feel. I think academia was a good home for me because they just leave you alone here mostly, and you can be a nutty professor and follow your interests. And so it worked out well for me in the end. But most of my teachers were in complete agreement that I was just going to be a disaster. I thought they might enjoy the fact that I ultimately became a teacher myself and did published some things here and there. So that's why I put it in. So it is kind
Oh,
of a funny story. But yeah, they basically told me that straight to my face. So they weren't hiding it. The Dutch directness for people who are Dutch, they don't sugarcoat things. Um,
well, I
it,
think because now you're a professor at the University of Cambridge and you have an award-winning book and you're one of the most published psychologists active today. I think I understated all that too.
well, I guess, maybe they're right on average, right? But yeah, I was lucky in this case that they weren't right about my own path. But I see it in, being an educator now myself, I'm much more sensitive to the fact that students are all on a different journey and have different ways of learning, and I don't punish, non-conforming students. And so I do sometimes alert students to the fact that, sometimes when you take risks, it doesn't pan out. Yeah, I try to encourage different ways of learning and exploration, and I focus less on test passing unless it's obviously important for academic progress. But So yeah, it did impact me, and I think in the way I pursue education. So yeah, it's an interesting it's an interesting story. They were kind of mean about it, I should say, in high school, and yeah, I also struggle sometimes with attention and other things. I wasn't the easiest student to try to teach. So it's not all on the teachers, but yeah, yeah. I'm not sure how how it is for you when you teach. Certainly, when you have large classes, it's much more difficult. Obviously, when there are students there distracting the whole class. But yeah, I try to integrate it. I certainly sometimes I have students in my class who like to disrupt the class, and I try to make something out of that rather than then sort of send them off and saying that they have no future. So yeah, that's the story.
I love it. I love it. So, Sander van der Linden, thank you so much. All around science baddie and author of Foolproof. Thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me on.